Assalamu alaikum. We will do lecture 26 today, and I will do another poem by William Yeats with you. In the last lecture, let's just recap briefly what we did in the last lecture. In the last lecture, we discussed the other two poems by William Yeats. One was The Rose Tree, and the other was The Wild Swans at Pool, if I remember the name correctly. If the two poems were different in themes, they had different themes in fact. The first poem, The Rose Tree, had more in common with the other poem that I discussed with you in some other lecture, and that was The Easter Rising 1916, which was historical as well as political in nature. And it explored Irish nationalism and the Irish civil rights movements that were part of the 20th century Irish Ireland. So the two poems were linked as far as the themes are concerned. But this other poem, the third poem that we discussed, it was different in nature because it came out more as a work of a romantic, because we see Yeats admiring the beauty in nature and admiring the sense of immortality, the sense of eternity in nature. And we see him comparing that eternity and that bliss and that happiness that is part of nature, and that abundance and fertility that is part of nature, and that carefree and wild aspect that is part of nature. We see that he is comparing those aspects with his own position. Yeats is aging now. He's past his youth now, and he is approaching his old age. So he is looking back at his youth, and but he admires that continuity, that cyclic nature, that cyclic aspect of nature, where there is birth, death, and then rebirth, as we saw Shelley also talking about it, and in so many other romantics admiring that quality in nature. But it's in case of man, as Yeats points out, it is not reversible. The body is gradually, it becomes weak, it degenerates, and when man becomes old. So he is talking about those dilemmas, problems of old age, when the feelings, the passions, the emotions, and we saw how he talks about the desires, and he talks about the ability to move around freely, the freedom and the bravery associated with that. So he is lamenting the loss of all of those. So this was a poem which threw a different light on this poet. We saw Yeats in a totally different light, because we saw him as as expressing his personal views, as expressing his personal self and his own feelings, his personal feelings and ideas about his personal grief, unlike the other two poems. In today's lecture, as I mentioned in the previous lecture also, we shall look at this poem with the title Sailing to Byzantium. Now this is another very important work of Yeats, and a very well-known work. The poem is highly symbolic, and because of its symbolic nature and because of the complex imagery and the symbols that are employed in the poem, it is very renowned amongst the critics, and it has often led to different interpretations from different people in different ages. But the poem can well be compared to Keats's poetry, and especially his poem on Ode on a Grecianan. If you recall that ode, the Ode on a Grecianan by Keats, you remember that Keats sees this beautiful object of art, and when he describes to us the paintings that are etched on the body of the urn, he's telling us how happy those faces, those people that are drawn on the urn, how they are happy, and their happiness is forever, it is eternal, it is unchanging, it is never changing, and how he compares the eternity and the permanence and the unchanging nature of their lives with that of his own life's impermanence, of his own life's temporariness. We saw how for Keats life was eternal, art was eternal, art was for all ages, for all times. It had this timeless quality about it. It's also for all ages. So he is admiring that quality in a piece of art, and he compares that piece of art to man's dilemma, and that is mortality. That is, man will face an end, that man's life has to come to an end, and man must leave this world. He cannot stay here forever and ever, like the piece of art which was part of the Greek culture in a long time back, then was transferred to the Romans, and then from Romans it was passed on and carried forward by the Renaissance scholars. So the thoughts, the themes, the artifact, it all survived through generations, and that was how art survived, and that was the beauty of the art. This was Keats' lament. Here also, if you keep that in mind, you will find it easy to understand the poem. The poem Sailing to Byzantium shares similar notions, similar ideas, and similar concepts. This poem Sailing to Byzantium is about Yeats's desire and his concern about this the mortality of human being, and about the fear of old age, and about, so he wants to sail to this imaginary land. Byzantium is an actual name of a historical place, but Yeats does not intend to mean it exactly that. He means, he's talking about any imaginary land, because he's going to give you images from an imaginary land. So he wants to sail to this imaginary land which is part of art, and where everything is preserved, it is unchanging, and it is for all times. He wants to become like a monument of art. He wants to be alive forever, and he does not want to face the ugliness of old age. So we see Yeats yearning here to escape from old age, to escape from the burden and the ugliness of old age, and he wants his energy and his youth back, and he understands that he can only have it not in this world but in some imaginary world. So it is Yeats's desire to be transferred, transported, taken to this other world where everything is lasting, it is forever, and it is permanent. So the poem is, in that sense, is also a unique poem. But as we shall see, the hallmark of the 20th century writers and poets is the complex use of symbols in their works. We shall see once again Yeats employing a complexity of symbols, and it is through those symbols that he builds and he gives us a complete meaning. So let us see how he achieves that. And before we look at the poem, let's see what the poem actually holds for us, what it means for us, and what is the background to the poem. Sailing to Byzantium was first published in 1928 as part of Yeats's collection, The Tower. And it contains only 4 stanzas, and yet it is considered to be one of the most effective expressions of Yeats's artistic craft. So it is a short poem. You can see it's not a very long poem. It contains only 4 stanzas, and it is considered to be one of the most effective expressions of Yeats's artistic craft. And as we analyze the poem, you shall see why it is called, or it is considered as the most effective expression of his artistic craft. How is it that it is a masterpiece? And then a brief summary of the poem for you is here. To escape the agony of old age, Yeats decides to leave the country of the young and travel to Byzantium, where the sages in the city's famous gold mosaics, which was completed during the 6th and the 7th centuries, could become the singing masters of his soul. So this is just a brief summary of the poem, where the poet's desire is to escape this country of the young people, where only young people and their emotions and sentiments matter, and he wants to travel to this imaginary land, which is Byzantium, where there are sages or wise people who are shown in carved, as if carved in a gold mosaic, and he wants them to become his masters, to teach him the song for the soul. So this is just in a gist the summary of the poem. In 1931, Yeats wrote that he chose to symbolize the search for the spiritual life by a journey to that city, because Byzantium was the center of European civilization and the source of its spiritual philosophy. So we see that Yeats's choice of the word Byzantium, of the name Byzantium, is not random. He picked it up carefully. When he decides to name the poem or this imaginary land Byzantium, he has planned it, and it is a careful selection on his part. He says he wants to represent the spiritual journey. So this journey that is revealed to us in the poem is a spiritual journey. It's a journey from the physical, sensuous pleasure to the pleasures of the spiritual world or the spiritual life. So it's a journey from the physical to the spiritual, as we shall see in the poem. So the place, this imaginary place Byzantium, or this city Byzantium, represents for Yeats a spiritual city. So Byzantium, because was the center of the European civilization, it was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire in the 4th or maybe 5th centuries AD. It was at the height of the Roman Empire, when the eastern part of the Roman Empire ruled over the eastern western territories, including Turkey, including modern-day Turkey, and Byzantium was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. And it was the center of all intellectual activity. It was where, like we used to have in Baghdad, the center of all intellectual academic activity. In a similar way, Byzantium was a source of all philosophical, academic, or intellectual activity. There were many libraries there, many books were there. All of them had been transferred down from the Greek civilization and were kept there, were preserved there. So, and even works from the Arab scholars were kept there. So it was the center of civilization. And it was also a source of spiritual philosophy, because it was a source of intellectual activity. So it from here also originated the spiritual philosophy. So that is why Yeats regards Byzantium as a source of spiritual inspiration. So Byzantium becomes his source of spiritual inspiration. It is a source, it is the country which gives him spirit, which inspires him spiritually. So when he sails, he decides to sail from our physical world. He yearns to go to a spiritual world, and that he describes to us as Byzantium. Byzantium was a capital in, I'm reading the last part, Byzantium was a capital in 5th, 6th centuries of the Roman Empire. So it's not 4th and 5th, but it was a capital in the 5th, 6th centuries of the Roman Empire, recently Istanbul. After the Muslims took it from the Christians, It was named Istanbul, and but here in the poem, as we see, it is described as with its old name, which was Byzantium. Now the second point that I missed says the poem is noteworthy for its evocative imagery and interwoven phrases as the poet immerses in life and at the same time strives for permanence. This is an important part of the poem. It contains a lot of evocative imagery, and there are interlinked, interconnected, interwoven phrases, because we shall see that poet immerses us, he immerses the readers also into his this concept, into his world, into his poetic world. So with the passion and with this extreme desire to be transported and to be transferred to this imaginary spiritual world and to attain permanence and to attain eternity, the poem has a high emotional quality. It has got a high emotional strain, and that is why the poet uses highly evocative imagery. Is the imagery which evokes passions or emotions and which makes us think. So the imagery that he uses is evocative. It arouses emotions. So the beauty of the poem lies in all of these facts, and we need to see how Yeats is able to accomplish that beauty that we have discussed so far. Let us look at the poem and let's see how how these different notions are integrated into the poem. Stanza 1 begins abruptly. You see that in the very first line, Yeats does not leave us any mystery. He is very explicit, he is very blunt, in fact he is very abrupt. He says, that is no country for old men. He's talking about this world. When he says a country, he does not necessarily mean Ireland. He's talking about this world. So he says, this world, now that I have become old, it appears that it is no place for old men like me. It has got no importance for old men like us. Here we are not privileged. Here we are not honored. Here old men are not taken seriously. So this is why he says this is no country. This is no world for old men. Old men do not belong here. The young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations, at their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas. Then he gives you the images from nature. He gives you an image of nature that is in abundance, nature that is fertile, nature that is violent, nature that is productive, and in nature where this is a cyclic birth and rebirth. So he gives you different pictures, these images from nature, to show to you that it actually is a world for young people. It actually is a world for those who have only their desires and emotions in them, and who are led by their emotions and desires, who go only for the physical and the sensual pleasure. So it is the world which is ruled, which is governed by sensuous and the physical pleasure. Sensuous, we've used this word so many times now. The meaning of the word should be very clear to you. Sensuous means it refers to our senses, involving all senses. So he says in this world is the sensuous, the sensuous feelings, the sensuous emotions, or the sensuous pleasures, they are given more importance, they are more sought after, and this in old age they die out, because the old man becomes weak physically as well as mentally. So the importance of sensuous and physical pleasures has dimmed for him. So the world changes for him. It is not the same world as it used to be when he was young, and when he could also enjoy like the others, and when he could also take part in the sensual pleasures and the physical pleasures. So he gives us those images from nature showing the productivity, fertility in nature. He says there are young people in one another's arms taking this sensual pleasure from each other. Birds are in their trees. Birds in pairs are singing in their trees. He also calls them the dying generations, those dying generations. But although he says birds and these young people, they do die, they are part of the dying generations, but at that time they're not aware of it. So birds in their trees at their song, and they are singing their songs. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas. Then he's talking about different kinds of fish, the salmon and the mackerel. He says the seas, the rivers, salmon lives in cold water, in cold rivers, and mackerel is also a kind of fish that is in abundance. So he says the seas, waters, and the rivers are full of fish of all kind. So he's showing us how things are in abundance in nature, how nature is fertile, and how fertility is associated with nature, and it is all due to all due to our pleasures of flesh, this productivity and this fertility that is increasing. Fish, flesh or fowl, commend all summer long, whatever is begotten, born and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of unaging intellect. Now he summarizes it for you. He says fish, flesh or fowl. So fish he's talked about, flesh also when he's talking about the youngs in each other's arms taking pleasure of flesh. And the fowl are the birds. He talked about the birds in pairs hidden in the trees and singing their songs from the trees. He says they are involved in their sensuous activities all summer long. All summer long. They have all the time in the world. So summer here is a symbol of youth, is a symbol of youthful energy, but it's also a symbol of sensuous physical pleasures. It's also a symbol of the pleasures of the flesh. So he says they are forgetful of old age, they're forgetful of death, they are living in their own world, they are living in their own world of joy and happiness and sensuous pleasures and physical pleasures and joys of the flesh, and they have no time to think of what is to come, about old age, about death. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of unaging neglect. Now then he contrasts this sensuality with the intellectual, and also the transitory with the permanent. He says that soul should be free of the shackles which are imposed by the sensuous passions. And how does he say it? He says everything in this world which is made only for the young ones, which is made only for the young spirits, which is made only for those who can feel and who can take happiness from the sensual pleasures or the pleasures of the flesh. He says in this world everyone is caught in the sensual music, and they are so caught in the sensual music that they all neglect what he calls the monuments of unaging intellect. He says they neglect, they do not pay attention to, they ignore, and they're careless about the monuments of unaging intellect. they forget that they will age, that these passions will go away from them, but they have no time in their absorbed in their own life, in the music of their own life. They are deaf to the music of the artistic world. They are deaf to the music of art. They are deaf to the music of permanence, because he calls them monuments. These monuments of unaging intellect are, he's referring to art and poetry and literature. So, and it may be paintings, it may be sculpturing, anything. So these are the monuments of art. He says they are of unaging intellect. They have to do not with passions, but they have to do with the intellect, and they are unaging. They never change. They remain the same. Their beauty remains the same. The passions that they inspire, they remain the same. So these monuments of art, these monuments of literature, they are unaging, they are permanent, they are eternal. So he is comparing here the sensuals with the intellectual in the last two lines. And the sensuous, he says, are transitory. The sensuous emotions and feelings, he says, are not eternal, but the monuments of art, they are permanent, they are eternal. So this was stanza 1, where he introduced to you different images from nature, and then in the last few lines of that stanza he told you how this sensuous pleasure, or these sensuous pleasures, are temporary in nature. Now in stanza 2 we shall see he will take the idea further. He says, an aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Now he calls an aged man, an old man, he calls him a paltry. A paltry is insignificant, not important, unimportant. He says he loses his importance. An old man is important for no one. He's like an insignificant creature. His presence is not taken any, is not given any importance. And then he gives you a picture of the old man, and he compares the old man to a scarecrow. He says he's like a tattered coat upon a stick. Like on a stick, we put the coat on and a hat on, and we place that stick near the fields, near the crops, in order to scare away the crows, and we call this the scarecrow. So he says the old man is just like a scarecrow, with his clothes hanging about his thin and frail and decaying body. So in old age the body is decaying, and because the body is decaying, it is like a stick. It's not the thinness that he's talking about, but he's also talking about this body being devoid of feelings, the body being devoid of desires, the desires of the flesh, the body being devoid of feelings. So he is talking about that loss also. So he says he has become more like an object to scare away the ugly creatures. Unless soul clap its hands, so he says the old man's status shall not change. He in this world he's like a scarecrow unless he does something. And what he says, soul clap its hands and sing. Unless his soul, the soul of the old man, he says, it starts to sing its own song. In the previous stanza he talked about the song, the singing of the sensuous world, the music of the sensuous world. But now he's talking about the music or the song of the soul. He says the soul of the old man, the body has become, is decaying, it has become weak and frail, but the soul is still the same. The soul has not changed, he says. So the soul has to become alive. The soul has to clap its hands and sing. and louder sing, he says, for every tatter in its mortal dress. The mortal dress, our physical body. And he says the soul has to sing and sing louder, so that those the music of the sensuous world is drowned in the music and the song of the soul. And it has to is to sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. It has to sing in order to subdue, or in order to suppress the pain caused by the degeneration of the body. And then he says, nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. Now he says there are no singing schools. That soul is not taught. In this world there are no schools which teach the song, how to sing, which teach the soul how to sing. So in this world there are no such schools, he says. There are no singing schools, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. So he says the only way the soul can learn to sing is by studying the monuments of permanence, is by studying these monuments, these arts and artifacts, these literature, the poetry, the prose, the novel, the dramas, of its magnificence, of its own magnificence. So it can learn the soul is eternal. It's not a temporary. The soul is unchanging. So the soul can only learn from something of its, from someone of its own kind, and the soul can learn in this way from art, an artifact, because that is also permanent and that is also unchanging. So the temporary world, the world of pleasure, sensual pleasures, and the world of flesh cannot offer any teaching, schooling to the soul, because it has no place for soul. It has no place for emotions as worthy and noble and sacred as that of the soul. This is a world which is ruled and governed by flesh, by the desires of the flesh. So you see what he's doing in the second stanza. Actually, he's negating all that that the physical world is about. He is driving you gradually towards an independent soul. He wants to disconnect or he wants to sever the connection between the soul and this physical world, the soul of the old man and this physical world. The world is for the young, because they can enjoy the sensuous physical pleasures, but the old, which are feeble now, and their soul desires to be set free of this feeble body, because the soul is still young, and the soul wants to escape from this feeble body. It wants to sing its own kind of song. It wants to be free in its own way. So he's describing as if the soul is a different thing from this sensuous world. So there are two entities that he's created here. And then he says, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. Now he's telling us why he came to this place. He says, and this is why I sailed the seas, I crossed the seas and came to this holy city of Byzantium. Look at the word that he uses. He calls it holy. He says, I have come to the holy city. Again, the word holy, it doesn't mean that he's giving it any religious significance, or he's using the word holy for religious authority. He's using the word holy here because of the spiritual sense, because he associates Byzantium, the actual historical place, as a center of spiritual philosophy. But when he talks about his imaginary world here, and he uses the word holy, he is talking about the world of the soul here, the soul which is sacred, the soul which is permanent, the soul which is eternal. So he calls this place a holy place. Then stanza 3. He is describing to us this imaginary place. He has got there, he's reached there, and he tells us how he's received in this new imaginary land. He says, O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, perne in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. He sees these sages standing there and welcoming him as he comes upon this imaginary land. And he says that they are standing in the God's holy fire, that these sages are the holy people. They says they are standing, they are burning with love of God. So he gets to this imaginary place, to this imaginary holy land, and he sees holy and wise people who are there to receive him. And he said they are burning with a passion for God. And this is why he uses the phrase holy fire, God's holy fire, to tell us that they are burning in passion. The souls of these sages are always burning like the fire for the love of their Lord. But then he describes to them, as he says, they are circling around him. They're circling around him as if a gold mosaic is drawn on a wall, as if their pictures are etched on a wall, on a wall in gold. So he tells them that they have been as gold is a result of burning metal in a fire for a long time. It's a long process, but then he says, so they have come from a holy fire. So they are not, these sages, he doesn't tell us that they are part of our world. They were part of our world. He says that they come from a holy fire. They're burning and they're standing in God's holy fire. And he says, I see them standing in God's holy fire. They are all around me as if drawn on in a mosaic on the wall. Perne in a gyre. And then perne is a bird, kind of a bird, and gyre is it's an image that is very common with Yeats, and he's going to use it more forcefully in his other poem that I'm going to discuss with you in the next lecture. But a gyre is it's like a spiral. A gyre is a spiral which moves from a certain point, from a narrow point, and then it widens and widens and widens. It moves in a circle and then it widens, and as it widens, as it moves away from the center, as far away it is from the center, the wider its circumference is. So he's describing to you how these sages they are all moving all around him in this fire, in this holy fire of God, and like he says, like a gyre moves in a circular fashion, as a bird caught in a gyre moves in a circular fashion. And then he says, he makes a wish, he makes a prayer to them, and he asks them, he says, and be. So he already addressed them in the opening line when he said, O sages. So he says, be the singing masters of my soul. So he's now decided that since he could found no school and no way of learning the song in the physical world, in our world, he has now sought this imaginary place so that he could learn the song of the soul. So he wants them to become his masters, to teach him the song of the soul, because the song of the body he has sung. He sang it in his youth, and the song of the youth was the song of sensuous pleasures, the song of pleasures of flesh. So he says he had sung that song all his life, and it was all that the world, the physical world, could ever teach him. But it has no place, and it knows no song for the soul. So that is why, now that he had become old in that world, and his body had become feeble and devoid of any physical desires, he says, and the soul had awakened in him. He says that the soul now needs to be taught its own song. So from the song of the body that he's talked about in the first stanza, he's not talking about learning the song of the soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fastened to a dying animal. It knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Then he says, consume my heart away. He asks those sages to purify his heart. It is the same image that you may have studied in Donne's poetry, in Donne's holy sonnets, when he prays, when he's begging God to let the fire burn away and eat away his sins and to purify his heart. It is the same prayer that Yeats seems to be making here. He wants those sages, he says, to eat away, to burn away the impure, the ugly, and anything related to the desires of the physical world. He says he wants those to be eaten away. He wants them to be eaten away by the fire, to be consumed by the fire. And he wants the heart to be purified. So he says, sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal, it knows not what it is. Now he's talking about his soul and his heart. He says, it was sick with desire. My heart in his youth, it was sick with desire, the physical desire, and it was fastened to a dying animal, and this dying animal is the body, the decaying body in old age, which will soon die, he says. So it is my soul and my heart, which was still sick with desire. It is still inside this dying animal, which is my decaying body. It knows not what it is. It does not know its true worth. And gather me into the artifice of eternity. And then he says, I want to be part of the eternal world. I want the soul to be where it belongs. I want my soul to become the part of this eternal world of art. And he makes it plain here, because he says, gather me into the artifice of eternity, gather me into the eternal world of art and artifact. So he wants his soul to be set free from the decaying body. He wants it to be set free of the decaying body. The mortality here is contrasted with eternity. Apparently the body dies. There is death in our physical world, but then he says, but for the soul, the journey begins, the immortality begins, the eternity begins. And when in this way, when the soul is freed of the sensual desires, it is transformed into an object of eternal value. So this is why he's asking the sages, who themselves are burning in the holy fire of the Lord. He says, he asks them, implores them to also burn away his desires, burn away his desires of flesh and his passions, so that his soul can be transformed into an object of eternal value. So these desires he now sees as something debased, he sees these desires still linking him, connecting him, fastening him to the physical world. He wants to be free of those sickening desires, so that his soul can go on a journey of its own, so that its soul can go on to have an eternal existence, to have the eternal life, and to have eternal pleasure. And so long as a soul is still attached to the worldly desires, so long as the soul is still desiring the sensual pleasures, he says there is no eternity for the soul. This is why he wants to sever ties. He wants his soul to sever ties with the desires completely, so that his ties with the physical world end also, and he can be part of the eternal world. In the next stanza, he says, once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling. Now he creates a beautiful picture, and he says, once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing. Now he is so disgusted with his natural life, with the kind of life that he led. He says, once this life is over, I shall never take the same bodily form again. If I'm given the chance, if my soul is told to return to any other form, I shall never take the same form, the same body again. This also shows the Yeats's own belief in the cyclic nature of birth and rebirth. Like I'm sure you're aware of the Buddhist belief, they also believe in this, in the charkha, as they call it, and as they describe it, there is a cyclic nature of birth, then death, and then rebirth, and it's like in the Hindu religion also, where we know that the souls have 7 lives, so a soul can be repeated 7 times. In Buddhist religion, the concept is slightly different, but they are related. But according to their beliefs, basically, if you do well, if you do good deeds in your life, you get to choose your next life, or maybe you come back in a better form, in a better shape. And if you don't do well, if you don't do good deeds in your life, then you come back in the shape of some insects or slithering, slimy snakes. So it depends upon your deeds. Your next birth depends upon your deeds. So the soul has 7 lives, as it is stated in the Hindu religion. So Yeats here is drawing from the same myths. He's drawing from the same myths, and he says, if I am given the chance, if my soul is given the chance to take any other shape in the next life, I shall never come back to the same bodily form again. But such a form, and which form would I like to take? He says, as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling. He says, but I would like to take the form which these Greek goldsmiths used to make, and they used to make the object of gold and gold enameling to keep a drowsy emperor awake. So he's talking about those small beautiful birds that these Greek craftsmen used to make, the beautiful birds drawn in gold, then which the song of that bird used to keep the drowsy emperor awake. So he says, I want to be transformed. I would want my soul to be transformed into the body, into this form of those gold enameled singing birds, which are made by the Greek artisans, which are made by the Greek artists. And this way I would be permanent. This way I would have an eternal existence. This way I would be part of art. So he doesn't long to be back to this physical world of ours, but he longs to be part of the world of eternity. He says that if he gets the chance, he would like his soul to be transferred, transported into the world of art, to become one with the world of art. He chooses an object of art. He chooses those objects, or those small birds which are gold enameled, either etched or drawn or created. He says he would like to become an object of art, and he would like to sing to some emperor who is drowsy all the times, and in order to make him go to sleep, I would sing beautiful song. Or he says, set upon a golden bow to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium, of what is past or passing or to come. Or second option is, he says, or I would like to be the bird, again the gold enamel bird, but this time he says not in a court, not in the court of an emperor, but sitting on a golden branch and singing to lords and ladies of Byzantium. And she says, I would sing, and he says, I would sing of past or passing or to come. And he, again in this stanza, we have this repeated image of gold. The bird, he says, would be gold enameled. And the bird that sings in this emperor's court, Yeats may here may be referring to a painting that he may have seen of Greek art, in which these golden courts have these golden birds, and the golden beautiful bird sings to the emperor to make him go to sleep. Or there are golden birds shown sitting on the branches of golden trees, singing to the lords and ladies of Byzantium, of this imaginary land, and singing of all times, of past, present or future. Gold, as much as it is as a symbol of wealth, it's also the symbol of purity. It signifies the purity of the soul that is purified of the sensuous desires, the soul that is purified of the desires of the flesh, the soul that is purified of the material desires, the soul that is purified completely of the passions of the world, the passions of the youth. So you see, he's employing images, he employs these symbols to put across and to emphasize his ideas and his themes. But in the last stanza, he shows you that he wants to become one with that world of art. He wants to be part of the world of art. So he does not want another life in his own world, but he wants to be reborn into the world of art, to become an object of art. He doesn't bother about the same kind of life anymore. He wants to be an object of art, so that he's at least eternal, at least permanent, and his life and existence will not be temporary, and he shall not have to go through the pains and misery of old age. So this was his most famous poem, Sailing to Byzantium, the poem in which he employs imageries, he employs complex images, he employs complex symbols, and he explains in a manner completely different from that of Keats how he desires to become part of the immortal world of art. Let us see how the poem can be analyzed. Yeats also said something, had to say something about the poem. So this source, in fact, of these themes that come from this, that emerge from this poem, Sailing to Byzantium, they can be found in Yeats's own work of 1925, A Vision, which he wrote in 1925 in which he develops his cyclical theory of life. Again, at the center of the poem, the central theme of the poem revolves around this cyclical theory of life, that life does not end with death. He sees a cyclic nature of death, just like the cyclic nature, course of events in nature. There is birth, then death, and then rebirth. So, in the same way, in the life of man, he sees the same cyclic nature. There is birth, then death, and then rebirth again in some other form. So it is this cyclical vision that he has explained in his other work that is at the center of this poem. It is not that he is like Keats, he's afraid of death. It is not that he projects death as filling him with awe and fear and sadness. Here Yeats is looking at death in a different manner. It's for him, it is not the ending. For him it is the beginning of another life. So his wish is that when that other life begins, when that new life begins, he wants to be part of the eternal. He wants to be part of the eternal world of art. He doesn't want to come back to the in the same form, in the same human form. He wants to come back and return as an object of art. So there is this difference in the approaches of the two poets, and the reason is his theory, his cyclical theory of life. And it is this cyclical theory of life that makes all the difference between the two poets and the two poems. In Sailing to Byzantium, Yeats used the concept of the spiraling gyre to suggest that opposite concepts such as youth and age, youth and old age in fact, body and soul, nature and art, transience and eternal, are in fact mutually dependent upon each other. Again, this suggests the difference from Keats and Keats's poem Ode on a Grecian Urn. This concept of the spiraling gyre that he uses, it suggests these contrasts. Let us first look at the contrast, because these are also the themes of this poem. The theme is basically the contrast, the difference between youth and old age. We see how Yeats talks about and connects youth with the sensuous desires and old age with the lack of them. Youth with fertility and productivity, and old age devoid of all that, and he compares him to a scarecrow or a stick. So there are these opposite concepts, but at the same time he's saying that they are mutually dependent upon each other. They are linked to each other, they're not separate from each other. Now, body and soul, in the same way he says, the soul, because in the last two paragraphs he said the soul is connected to the body. It's fastened to the dying animal, he says. So the soul is not completely separate from the body. They are also mutually dependent upon other. The body, as the behavior of the body decides the behavior of the soul also. In youth, the body decides, leads, and the soul follows. When it is old age, he says, it is time that body becomes weak and the soul follows. So they are interdependent and they affect each other. And then nature and art, then we see how he contrasts nature with art. He shows how nature, in the first stanza he talked about the flora and the fauna, not flora, but he talked about the birds, he talked about the fish, he talked about this kingdom, animal kingdom in nature, and he showed nature through them. He talked about birds. He said that they're all part of dying generation. So for him nature does not have permanence, but art, he says, is permanent. So he contrasts them, but yet again we see that there is a link between the two. The birds may be part of the dying generations, but there is a cyclic pattern in nature also. So the death is not final. Then there is rebirth and the cycle continues. So the nature and art, they cannot also be separated. Transient and eternal. So transience leads to eternity, and eternity cannot be studied apart from transience. So transience, life is transient, it is temporary. Art is eternal, art is for immortal, art is for all times. But he says the eternity cannot be understood without understanding the going through the temporary phase. So they are all dependent, themes are dependent and linked to each other. And this concept of the spiraling gyre, this I'm going to explain to you now. He says that yoked together by a gyre and the poem itself, the mutually interpenetrating opposites, thesis and antithesis, resolve in such a way as to produce a synthesis that contains a larger truth. This idea is drawn from Hegel's theory of dialectic. Yeats was a very well-read person, and he was very much involved in some mystical and societies. So he had studied also, he was impressed maybe with this philosopher Hegel's theory of dialectic, according to which the thesis and antithesis, they produce a synthesis, like plus or minus together. The positive and the negative, they are not two separate things, but positive and negative both are required to produce the desired result, to produce the synthesis. So he says the action and the reaction, they are both required for a whole action. So he says that these opposites are all interpenetrating, interlinked, interdependent. This is how, and this is what he does in the poem. The contradictions, the opposites, they are all resolved. They're all interdependent, they are all interlinked, and they all come out as if they are all part of one whole system, that are part of one larger truth. And Sailing to Byzantium has at least two symbolic readings, both mutually interdependent upon the other. The poem is both about the journey which is taken by the speaker's soul around the time of death, and the process by which, through his art, the artist transcends his own mortality. So there are two symbolic readings. One is, at one level, we read the poem as a journey, which is a journey of a soul, which is taken when the body becomes old, at the time of death. So it is the soul's journey in one reading, and it shows the process through which, through his art, secondly, how the artist, he transcends his own mortality. So he shows how an artist, through his own work, can become immortal. So there are these two themes that, or through two ways in which we can interpret the poem. One is to, as I've done with you, to see how the soul, how it is a soul's journey, and from the physical, the temporary world to a spiritual, eternal world. And secondly, it shows how through art, artists become immortal. They transcend their mortality. So it is an account of an artist's journey, the poem. How the artist, by tracing the temporary world around him, by etching the temporary world around him, he himself becomes eternal in the process. He becomes immortal in the process through his work. Then here are these rough images that I've just drawn for you of the gyre or the spiral that we have been talking about. And it is to show to you why we keep on saying that Yeats says they are interconnected. The opposites are interconnected. The opposites are interlinked. The opposites are interdependent. He says that because, as you can see, if you look at the image B, which is smaller and clearer, I'm sorry about the drawing, but this is the best I can do at the moment. But if you look at the B, you can see that the spiral, this gyre, it begins from a narrow point, it widens and widens and widens. And when it widens to its maximum limit, then according to Yeats's philosophy, the cycle begins again. But it begins from the narrow point once again, and then once again it starts to widen. So this is the cyclic nature of life that he talks about, and this is how he yokes the two together, because he's showing you here that how he's showing to you here how out of chaos, how out of death life begins again. So this is how temporariness is part of eternity. It is not separate from it, because from that extreme point, from the extreme widening point, if you see in picture B, there's a new birth, there's a birth of a new cycle. So it is this idea of a gyre and this image of a spiral which Yeats is so fond of, and which shows his belief in the continuity of things, and which also shows how he says all these things are linked. So they are not totally separate, they are one. And then the next point is that Byzantium represents what Yeats in a vision calls unity of being, in which religious, aesthetic and practical life were one, and art represented the vision of a whole people. I mentioned this work to you in the beginning of the analysis, but now I've got a quote for you. Yeats himself called the poem as a unity, as a harmonious whole. He says, in this poem, religious, aesthetic and practical life are one. So you see, he doesn't separate all of them. He says the religious, because he talks about the sages burning in the holy fire of Lord. He talks about the beauty of the art and artifact. He talks about the practical life. He talks about the worldly life. So they are all one. They are all linked, and one takes off from where the other leaves. So they are not separate from each other. They are all linked to each other. They are all interdependent upon each other. When the limit of one reaches, the other begins from there. So he says it. So in this way, it is a journey. It is a journey which never ends, and it's like the Buddhist concept of life that continues. And art is represented, he says, as a vision of a whole people. An important theme is the superiority of art over the natural. The artificial is seen as perfect and the unchanging, while the natural world is prone to ugliness and decay. This can be another theme of the poem. It is up to you which interpretation you want to take, but this can be another interpretation of the poem. But there is this irony in the poem, and the irony is that the artificial is seen as perfect. The artificial world of art, which is not actually the real world, and Yeats says that he would want to come as part in another life. He would like to come back and become part of the world of art. So he's giving emphasis to the artificial world, and the natural world he describes as ugly and decaying. So there is this irony here, that the artificial becomes more important and the real is insignificant and ugly for Yeats. But that can be another theme of the poem and another interpretation of the poem. So you see how complex the poem is, and it is complex because Yeats has desired it to be so. It is complex because it is linked to Yeats's these mythical ideas and his ideas about the spiraling gyre. It is linked to his idea of the continuity of life, continuity of existence, and the interdependency of all things. So he has a vision. He has his own ideas, and we shall see in the next poem that I'm going to do with you in the next lecture how he explores these ideas further. So I think that is enough for for today's lecture. I shall take leave now, and I shall meet you again in the next lecture with this last poem by Yeats, which is another very important work of Yeats. So thank you very much.